Hi all, I have yet another amazingly instructive game to show you today. This is Leela against Stockfish, TCEC Season 17 Super Final, round 88. So Leela lost the earlier round 87 in the very same opening, which was E4, G6, D4, C6. So Leela had lost this position with the black pieces, but now playing with the white pieces, would she concur with Stockfish over C4 as a move to try and discourage D5 from black? In fact, she did. Maybe this is an interesting way to approach the opening if both of these mighty engines, highly evolved mighty engines, agree on C4 here. We have D6, knight C3, knight D7, bishop E2, knight F6, knight F3, bishop G7. And this again looks like some sort of King's Indian defense position. Although it seems as though isn't black allowing or provoking E5 here. Leela avoids that provocation and just castles. If E5, it's quite interesting actually. It doesn't seem as though there's a total bust after knight G8, E6. Although this is rather scary. This kind of situation looks as though white's doing quite well. So it's an interesting idea, E5, with an idea of a pawn sack. If we look at this again, if knight G4, again, E6, disruptive pawn sack. If black has to give up the dark square bishop and get this position, you know, white's getting a big advantage sometimes. So it's fascinating that, but Leela decided against this for whatever reason, not playing E5. We have castling, and Stockfish castled. We have bishop E3, A6. So black keen on playing for B5. That's an interesting plan. However, pawns do not go backwards. Is this too much of a fixed structure to play for B5? If you look at that quotation from Michael Steen in his classic book, Simple Chess, he said you can retreat pieces but not pawns, so always think twice about pawn moves. So the irreversibility aspect is something to really consider. H3, we have B5, Queen C2, Queen C7, and now Leela plays C takes B5, Stockfish plays C takes. If A takes, that runs into a tactic. I hope you can spot. 5 seconds. Knight takes B5. Yes, that pinned pawn there. Knight takes B5. And white can just retreat the knight with a big advantage there. So C takes B5. Rook FC1. And you might think, especially if you're an attacking player, is there much to be excited about here for white? Is there much of an advantage? The queen goes to D8 here, away from this C file. You might think that's a bit strange. If bishop B7 instead, maybe queen B1, you know, with threats of hitting the queen, and the queen goes back to B8, we get this kind of position where, okay, white maintains that small edge. So, okay, queen D8, knight D2, we have knight B6. Bishop F3, as though E5 could be a big threat here. Knight E8. If bishop B7, E5, and this should be okay actually. That should be fine using the D5 square like that. So maybe there's other stuff white should consider there. Know what I mean? So instead of E5, though, Queen B3 is a sensible move, not giving black the D5 square. And for example, this with Queen B4 looks quite interesting. And white should have a small edge here. Okay, so after bishop F3 we have knight E8, B3, bishop B7, and now Leela plays A4. And this provokes the black pawn to B4. And this is very, very interesting how in this game it seems as though Leela is provoking the black pawns to be fixed and sort of torturing them after. You might think, well, how is this going to be tortured, this B4 pawn? And first of all, was it necessary? The question, was it necessary? If we look at B takes, it seems as though white can use the B6 square, for example, like this, at very least, and plonk a knight into B6 and get maybe a dangerous passed pawn. This is to be avoided. So it seems, okay, there's a certain necessity to play B4, but now there's another pawn moved. So you can retreat pieces, as as Michael Steen says, but not pawns. So is this going a step too far? The thing is, if knight f6, or rather, here's the thing, as Monk would say. So if knight f6, a5, knight b7, queen c7, queen b8, rook a4 tortures b4, you can see these aspects of provocation and torture, and they run through a lot of the variations that I've checked out on this game. It's rather remarkable. So say rook c8, we can take the queens off and take on b4, knowing that the knight is protecting c1, so that's nicking that pawn. So knight e2, we have a5. You might think a5 though, are these light squares to be tortured? Is the a5 pawn a subject of torture? How does white actually do this? If this structure is to be subject to scrutiny. Queen d1, we have e6. Rook c2, so white prepares to double the rooks. Stockfish is not interested in any attacking plan on the king side, is not in a position to do that. And plays knight f6, we have rook ac1, rook b8, and now we have queen f1, which does have the possibility of moving the knight and playing queen b5 to try and torture a5. This knight is pinned though, bishop a6. Just to put that on the board, if rook e8, actually instead of knight f4 here, more effective might be, actually I just gave that as an example, knight g3 might be the more effective, just to allow queen b5 next. So say h6, queen b5, and here say knight a8 to protect a5, d5, and this becomes strong for white after even a temporary pawn sack, because the bishop hasn't got too many squares. Bishop a7 makes that bishop unprotected, and now e5 exploits the unprotected piece and hits f6. And white ends up winning material. Yes, it's fascinating tactics as well, creating loose pieces sometimes. Some of these torture mechanisms, they're very dynamic. So just to recap there, queen b5. Now you might ask, well, forget bishop d5. If ed, then there's bishop a7. Yes, that bishop is a problem, it seems, sometimes in this pawn chain. Unlike its other bishop, fianchetto fellow partner, fianchetto bishop, that's protected by the king, but this is sometimes loose compared to the g7. So that has to be factored in here. So we have bishop a6 anyway, and the queen just goes back. So that little experiment is a low-cost experiment. Pieces can always be retreated. As Michael Steen says there, you can always retreat pieces. And it's part of actually of a torturing process, because these pawns are not going anywhere. This is a fixed structure to try and probe and torture somehow. So that particular thing doesn't seem to have done anything. Rook c8. We have knight f4 though now, and this unveils the possibility of bishop e2 to trade off that bishop and try and weaken these squares. We have a pair of rooks coming off, and now bishop e2, and black doesn't oblige. So we have the bishop actually occupying b5 now, knight f6. You might wonder, instead of the knight f6, what else can black do here? If e5, then in fact d takes, knight takes, f3. This is actually rather good for white, this kind of scenario, where you see that the bishop's kind of blunted, and white can get this battery onto the b6 square to try and torture a5 like this. That recurring plan that a5 is a potential victim in all this, and white can get quite a dominating position. This is just a sample variation where a5 could be victimized. So we have knight f6 and now f3, so blunting that bishop. Knight c8 is played. If e5 here, unfortunately this really doesn't work. This bishop is actually rather useful after d takes, knight d3, hitting e5. If knight h5, because rook e8, bishop takes, then there's bishop c5, and this wins in exchange in broad daylight, with white having a big advantage. So that bishop on b5 can be useful to try and win material, it seems. So knight c8 is played. Queen c1, so another battery trying to invade on c7, knight a7. The bishop drops back, not accepting the possibility of double pawns here. If rook c7 had been played, black should have adequate play here. It should be only a small edge for white after dissolving one of the problem pawns. So, okay, we have bishop d3, queen b8, knight c4, so hitting a5, that's protected. And the queen can't, you can't do this. I mean, there's also d6 as well is also here. The queen can't move here. That's the point of note, it's protecting d6. So knight c6. We have knight b6, knight e7. Yeah, because the rook takes c6 is now threatened. And so knight e7. We have bishop b5. And here, in fact, Stockfish is not listening to Michael Steen in Simple Chess. There's another provocation of another pawn chain over here being exposed and potentially tortured in its own right as well, independent of this torture over here. There's two microservice torture services being activated here, not just one, but another one. After g5, black setting up a parallel construction after g5, following up with h6 soon. Instead, we have to ask here, what if king h8? The problem is with knight f4, it has venom for d5 pushing into e6 here. And if ed rook c7, this scenario shows that white's getting a really big position sometimes. For example, like this is winning material. So it's a huge position that can be achieved here. As an example, that would be devastating. We look at this again, look at d5 instead, e5, and then knight d3. The knight can go into c5 potentially, or win the exchange. Well, and both win the exchange and use c5. It's such a fantastic position for white. And if we look at knight c8 as an alternative, knight takes, and then g4 is good. And if ever g5 here, this battery it's like a double battery here, not just the queen behind the rook, but also behind this bishop. And it means actually h4 is possible. And white's getting a big advantage, even winning material over there. So Stockfish, poor Stockfish, in this particular game, commits to g5. So knight e2, h6, yes. So if we look at this, we have two structures, a5, b4, and h6, g5. The associated weaknesses, well, light squares here. And we also have, light square weaknesses here. Okay, how can Leela celebrate on both sides of the board these fixed pawn structures? King h1 is the first move used. Knight g6, rook c7, knight e8. And actually here, Leela decides to give up the light square bishop. I guess intuitively we can say that this bishop isn't fantastic in this position. A lot of the point of white's play has been to blunt that bishop. So giving the opponent that light square bishop without the counterpart in this circumstance doesn't seem too bad. But also now there's knight d7, and it seems as though, gaining a tempo on the queen. And now knight g3, and it seems h5 is going to be celebrated with knight h5. And you'll note also this is actually rather dangerous for black's king safety. Sometimes you can see that a bishop takes g5 is on the cards. If the queen comes over here with a knight on h5 and a rook on the 7th, and the other knights conspiring on f6, you can see there's a recipe for disaster for the king here, with the queen stuck on a8 in this position. There's a total recipe for disaster brewing up here. Black played rook e7. And now let me just show you an example of a disaster scenario with king h7. Knight h5, king g8 as an example. Bishop takes g5 is actually working rather well. For example, this scenario, the black king is getting torn to shreds here, neglecting f7. But what else? If king f8, queen h6, or queen h6 anyway, is going to happen with queen g7 mating potentially. So this is just crashing through. So that's a total disaster scenario relating to king safety there, as an example. So we have this move rook e7, trying to avoid that sort of stuff. It gives the possibility of queen d8 to sort of try and evict this knight, which has this influence over that f6 square. We have d5 being played, and now you might wonder, d5, Well, let's have a look again. Instead of d5, let's try and go for the king. If knight h5, queen d8, and if knight f6, this scenario is also, it's not that bad for black. Black should be able to survive that scenario. So if we go back to d5, the point here now, black played queen e8 in this position. If e takes d, then that has a weakness of the last move. The knight compounds into f5. And here, knight takes d6 is crushing, hitting the bishop and the rook. So that's just winning material, or winning the exchange, or winning that bishop. It's a disaster. So it's a poison pawn. You can't really take this. So we have queen e8. And now rook takes b7. So no counterpart bishop at all. And queen c6. And it seems what this is about now is the fact that these guys are getting weaker and weaker through this series of exchanges. The endgames, with white having the dark square bishop, will be able to pick these pawns off like ripe apples, potentially. We have rook d8, knight e2. Here, if bishop b6, e takes, this scenario is also, it seems okay for white, quite nice for white. So there are many roads to Rome, it seems, here already. White seems to have a big advantage. Knight e2 was played. And we have rook c8. If e takes d5 here, white can play queen takes d5. And it's a nice position for white, looking at f7, queen in the centre like that. So rook c8, we have queen takes, so the queen's come off. D takes, F takes. It seems Leela's very, very polite about things, just wanting to win an endgame here. No kingside attack or anything. If rook takes e6, then check, and rook b5 tortures a5 here. And here, bishop d4, this position, that passed pawn is working quite well in this scenario. White should be able to capitalize on things and, for example, even win h6. So both sides of the board, those structural weaknesses working quite well against black in this endgame to give white a big advantage. So we have f takes. And now bishop b6, so the torture phase, this final torture phase in the endgame. Rook c8, rook c7, not letting black have counterplay here. Rook a8. This isn't going anywhere, a5 though. And the king comes in, king g1. Rook a6, the bishop retreats back, bishop e5, the king comes up towards the centre, h5, g3, rook a8, bishop e3, so probing this pawn, d5 is played here, hitting the rook. White is very polite, Leela's very polite, doesn't mind an exchange of rooks here. Is this really enough advantage to carry through, just to torture some pawns on the queen side? Rook takes, bishop takes, we have d takes e4, and in fact Leela seizes the opportunity to play bishop b6, and you might wonder, hold on a sec, if Stockfish had played bishop c7 to stop that, would that have made a difference here? If bishop c7 instead of taking on e4, it seems as though white can get a very good position anyway, like this. There's a nice blockade square on d4, and with f4 at this position, there's an f pawn mobility coming up, which is useful, giving the king f4, and there's a stranglehold on the black position. This is going to be a big advantage for white, and yeah, that g-pawn's a liability, as this example shows. So we have d takes e4. So for the moment, after bishop b6, white is actually a pawn down in this endgame. The thing is, these pawns are ready to be really munched. Now, they're ripe. They're ripe apples. King f7, finally. And in fact, Leela takes her time with g4 instead of taking on a5 immediately. Taking on a5 immediately does seem entirely possible with a big advantage. But g4 is playing bishop a1. If h takes g4, this actually helps the white king after king takes. And here, you know, this is nice for white. The white king can go to h5 even. And now look, there's a very dangerous a pawn there to push. That's a big advantage for white. So these scenarios are, you know, simplified but quite venomous, it seems, for black. G takes h5. Stockfish gives up a pawn there. King e3. knight c6, king d3, check, king c2, knight c6, bishop e3, looking at g5. So it seems black's been let off with these pawns. They've been given a quite the reprieve. It's gone back to over here now. This orchestra of torture on both sides of the board in this endgame. Bishop f6, we have knight g3 with the idea of knight e4 now to torture g5 again. But what is this? What about the a5 and b4, guys? Bishop d4 is played. This looks rather desperate, giving up g5, doesn't it? If king g7, the thing is, knight e4, king f7, knight takes g5 is nice for white. And if knight d4, that can be taken, and knight e4 is again nice for white. For example, like this, where the b7, the knight going to b7 will win a5, and that will create that passed pawn there. So yeah, these scenarios are not very nice. So bishop d4 giving up g5, bishop e5, knight moves after being hit, bishop d6, king d3, check, king e4, knight d7, king d4, knight c5, king c4 protecting b3, knight e4, bishop e3, looking to go back maybe to b6 one day, bishop f8, king d3. Also possible was king b5, it seems, off the check. This is possible, it seems, with white having an advantage. But king d3 was chosen. And now back to the torture of a5, finally, resuming torture of a5. Knight d5, bishop takes a5, finally, that pawn's taken off the board at move 72. King e7, king c4, king d7, knight d4, bishop g7. And now Leela sacks this h-pawn, h6. Bishop takes, this gives affordance now to play bishop takes b4 without dropping the knight. So two connected passed pawns now are created. Knight e3 check, king d3, e5, knight e2, knight d1. This knight seems as though it wants to be trapped. If knight d5 though, here's the thing, bishop c5 and then b4, and the pawns are pretty winning here in this scenario. For example, like this, white's getting a huge advantage. So knight e2, we have knight d1, bishop e1, bishop f8, knight c3. The knight's going to a very nice blockading square potentially. Knight b2 check. This knight is stranded and is given up. Yeah, Stockfish is in a bad situation here, a piece down now. And with these two outside passed pawns, they're too much for black. It's a totally one position. Yeah, the game ends here after bishop c3. I found the game fascinating because it seems as though the fixed structures, were provoked on both sides of the board. So a5 and b4 fixed structure, and the h6 and g5 fixed structure. And it's interesting, the little transactions that occurred, like giving up the bishop for the knight, and then blunting the bishop, and then playing for this d5, and then later sort of probing there, and then later over there, and then back over here. It's these structures could be tortured on both sides of the board in this game. Quite the positional masterpiece, you could argue, perhaps, in how you can encourage weaknesses and torture weaknesses systematically, repetitively, and in an orchestrative way on both sides of the board. So I hope you enjoyed this game. It has great positional beauty. Yeah, wow. So Leela did equalise from this opening. If you want to challenge me for a game, by the way, Kingscrusher.tv. If you register there, I'll be able to invite you for a game soon after. Or bit.ly/chessworld. There's also a suave chat forum at Kingscrusher.tv/discord. Now tell me your favourite draws as well. There's a suggestions forum. I might check out some of the more exciting draws that occurred in that amazing 100-game match. But I believe we're getting close to covering all the decisive games that happened from TCEC17. So that's quite an interesting thing as well. I like that sense of completeness sometimes. So bit.ly/Leela Chess or bit.ly/Stockfish Chess to check out the other games from TCEC, etc. that they played. bit.ly/Magnus Carlsen Chess. Okay, comments, questions, likes, shares appreciated. Thanks very much.